afternoon, and welcome back to Analysis 101. I want to thank you all so much for 10,000 subscribers. This is a goal that I never imagined I could possibly reach. It's a huge privilege to be able to make and post this content and to have people from all across the world watch it and interact with it as well, and I'm just so grateful to all of you. Thank you. I've been gone a while because I needed to finish my degree and also take some time off for my top surgery, and this shirt is actually a compression binder that I need to wear for the next week or so you have to promise not to judge me for how weird it looks. And I actually ended up being away for a lot longer than I wanted to be, but I have so much content that I'm really excited to share with you guys, and I appreciate everyone who's waited this long for another part in this series. And remember that if you like my content and you want to support me, the best way to do that is by liking this video and subscribing to my channel. And if you're feeling extra generous, you can also check out my Ko-fi as well and maybe send me a tip. Today we're going to focus on the most commonly requested topics from the first Analysis 101 video. You guys really wanted me to dive deeper into lenses and also talk about how to identify and write about symbolism. And one question in particular has popped up a lot, not only in the comments of that video, but also across my other socials and in my DMs. And that question is always along the lines of, I have all of my evidence, I just don't know how to turn it into an actual critical analysis. How do you take everything that you have and start actually writing? How do you take that first step? All of these topics are really cool, and I'm certain that you're going to find them really interesting, but a thing to note is that they're a lot more abstract than the last ones. And I just want to take this time to note that as we continue through this Analysis 101 series, each video is going to be a bit more complex than the last one. Which is to say that if you're confused and feel a little bit left behind, I suggest that you go back and watch the video before this, and this will be true not only for this part of the series, but for the rest of it as well. So if you watch video 1 and 2 and you feel confused when you start video 4, maybe go back and watch video 3, it's just a suggestion. And I'm sure that this isn't going to be a problem for most of you because so many people have been begging me for a part 2, but look, to be honest, I expected that part 1 would just flop and be a sad standalone, yet here we are. I've already talked for long enough about nothing, so let's get into it. First, I want to talk about critical lenses because you guys really loved them last time. But before I introduce you to a couple more, I want to address a really good question that someone asked me in the comments of the last video. And that question was, why not just focus on the author's intent and meaning? Why use something like a critical lens? While it is important to consider the author's perspective and experiences when we're analysing their work, you'll remember that a historical lens does this really well. It's sometimes really hard for us as readers to empathise with or even understand. And it just comes back to the fact that all art, including literature, is entirely subjective. Something that sticks out to me might not be that important to you, and vice versa. That's just how it works. So we use specific lenses that interest us to pick up on the subtextual evidence that the author has left behind. We can use a classic example and imagine that you're reading a text where the character is sitting in a room and the only thing that's described about that room is that there are blue curtains half covering the window. Now, because of the cultural implications that are associated with the colour blue, for me it's very easy to assume that these curtains are supposed to signify a depressed or saddened state of the character. And we can read into them even further by thinking about their shape, how much they cover the window, whether or not they clash with any of the other internal decor. But the question then becomes, did the author actually intend to leave behind all that information by just describing the curtains as blue? And to answer this, I want to share with you one of my favourite Tumblr posts of all time. Sometimes it doesn't matter if the author intended for the blue curtains to have meaning. Sometimes the author grew up in a society where colours have learned associations and subconsciously applied those associations in the text. Sometimes a reader who grew up in the same society or who has studied a certain society is able to pick up upon those associations and it enhances the story. Sometimes recognizing the associations that can be made consciously or subconsciously within a text will reveal a hidden layer of real-world context about the author. Sometimes the curtains are just blue, and sometimes the reason an author has chosen to use a goblin race as its evildoers is rooted in anti-Semitism. Do you see what I'm saying? I don't think people in general realise how much power they have when it comes to consuming any kind of media. And not to be like kids these days, but I can access literally any movie, any music, any book, at any time, anywhere. And it's really easy when things like this are so accessible to forget just how important they are. I just think that in general it's a shame that people treat books and music in particular as accessories to fit into a certain social group. And people are doing that instead of actively thinking about what media they're consuming. But that's besides the point anyway. You are going to have your own opinions about what I just said. What seems the most important to you out of everything? Did anything in particular stick out? Did it all make sense? The message that I'm trying to get across probably won't 100% align with what you learned. And that's essentially the reason that constructing your own analysis is really important, and you shouldn't just listen to everything that the author thinks. Anyway, lenses, let's go. So in the last video we looked at psychoanalytic, feminist, Marxist and queer lenses. Today I want to talk you through post-colonialism, eco-criticism, new criticism and post-structuralism. And something that I can't remember whether or not I mentioned in the last video is that these lenses can really overlap quite a lot. In fact, it's quite rare to look at a text and only be able to apply one lens to anything at a time. Let's start with post-colonialism. This is the lens that I really hated throughout high school because we used it in literally everything. But I have grown to appreciate this lens, even if the subtext that you can uncover tends to be quite depressing. Like its name suggests, post-colonialism focuses on the effects of colonization, particularly British colonization of the Caribbean, Africa and India. And something that I definitely forgot to mention last time is that lenses tend to be created in response to literature or literary movements. So post-colonialism first existed as a genre of text that was created by those who had been affected by colonization. And that developed into a lens which can now be used on any text, including those that are written by colonizers. And while the overall idea of discussing colonization seems quite simple, there are so many ways that you can delve into this kind of analysis. You could talk about cultural identity, including forced identity changes, lost identity, or diasporic identity. You could talk about language change, and here I want to note that post-colonialist works are written in English, which is the colonizer's language. You could write about struggles for independence, from literal battles to institutionalized racism, or you could talk about internalized racism, xenophobia, etc., and specifically look at how this is portrayed within the text by the author. Is it accidentally there, or did they put it there on purpose for you to look at? This lens can be more uncomfortable for some people to use than others because some people are dealing with trauma that stems from racism, and some people, like myself, were born into privilege. And using a post-colonial lens or reading a post-colonial book will most likely mean that you have to face that trauma or privilege head on, and that can be a really weird experience. If you're unable to think critically about racism and internalized racism in particular, this lens is going to be really difficult for you to use. But this lens is deeply interesting, especially if you're in a position where you can talk about how your own experiences relate to it, so I really highly recommend that you try it. Next we have eco-criticism or environmental criticism, which focuses on the way that the relationship between nature and humans is depicted. And eco-critical texts tend to be interdisciplinary, and they appear in fiction and non-fiction forms. And like the post-colonial lens, eco-criticism appears to be rather simple at first, but there are so many angles that you can approach this argument from. For example, you could focus on cultural attitudes towards nature and maybe compare multiple cultures, including your own. And this approach very easily goes hand in hand with the post-colonial lens, so if you're willing to try two new lenses at the same time, I really recommend these two. Or maybe you could focus on the way that issues within nature are portrayed. So you could focus on the way that characters react to big issues within nature itself, so like natural disasters, for example. Or you could choose to focus on characters who are in between humanity and nature and look at how they are portrayed and treated throughout the text. It could be a character who's more rooted in our reality, so someone like an environmental scientist, or it could be a fantasy character like the Lorax, for example. Personally, I love eco-criticism, and I was thinking about it from way before I even cared about literature or knew what a critical lens was. And of all the possible stories that you could use this lens on, I would recommend to you Princess Mononoke, Kaina of the Great Snow Sea, or Fern Gully. Some of you will definitely have recognized those names, and all of them bring an element of fantasy that just ties in with the eco-criticism lens so well. Next we have new criticism, which is a really interesting one because it's totally different to any of the other lenses that we've discussed so far. It's a type of formalist lens which states that literary texts should be totally distinguished from any other text. And it states that because of this, literary texts should be studied differently. To do this, new criticism assigns formal aspects to literary texts, which makes this lens about as scientific as you can get when you're discussing specific themes or aesthetics. Because themes and aesthetics, when they're viewed through a new criticism lens, become more than just subjective ideas. They become formal assets of a literary work. And look, to be honest, I got really overwhelmed when I was looking into this lens and what it was, but then I came to a really important realization. New criticism isn't only a type of formalist lens, it is the formalist lens. And it gained so much popularity in the 1960s that it changed the literary world forever, and we still use it in all of our analyses today. You can tell when someone is using a new criticism lens just by checking whether or not they include any evidence. And that's kind of a given nowadays. You'll notice that in all of my analyses that I post on here, I have as much information as I possibly can whenever I provide you with a snippet of text, for example. And evidence goes hand in hand with this lens because the most important aspect of a scientific discussion is that people can go ahead and fact check you. And when the audience can ensure that you're basing your claims around real aspects of the text, it makes your analysis more believable. So to use a new criticism lens, just continue as you were, but make sure that you cite your sources. That is incredibly important. Now let's move on to the last lens of this video, which is post-structuralism. It's sometimes called deconstruction. And this lens is, again, super different to any of the other lenses that we've discussed so far, because the aim of this lens is to tear apart the text or deconstruct it and reject the idea that there is a single theme or message at the center of everything. So this is basically the villain of lenses, if you will, and when you're using this, you want to be paying very close attention to all of the themes within the text and how they intersect with one another. It's the idea of taking something apart to understand what makes it work and how it runs, and pointing out that it isn't just one thing that makes the whole machine run, it's lots of little things that link together. And often post-structuralists will focus on pointing out the flaws of the text, usually by pointing out that it relies way too heavily on traditional assumptions to move the story along. The best example that I can think of to utilize this lens in would be in a work that's been translated across languages, because often those translations aren't 100% accurate and the cultural meaning is changed or completely lost, so it makes sense to its new audience. And I'd like to challenge any of you who have a story that you really like that was originally written in a different language to go back to that text and have a closer look at it. Is there any wording that seems a bit strange, something that doesn't really make a lot of sense, something that really stuck out to you? And for anyone who wants a text suggested to them, I have 2 links in the description that you can go check out. The first is Hell Screen by Octagawa Inosuke, and the second is The Moon Over the Mountain by Atsushi Nakajima. And what's interesting about both of these stories is that they're retellings, but Hell Screen is the retelling of a Japanese story, and The Moon Over the Mountain is the retelling of a Chinese story. And if you've noticed anything strange, and especially if you've gone ahead and tried to figure out why, I would love to hear your observations as well. Now let's move on to symbolism, because this is another topic that was really heavily requested in the last video. Firstly, what is symbolism? It's a word that we hear all the time, but it's rarely ever defined. Symbolism is the use of words or imagery to portray a specific object or idea. And the best way to understand how symbolism works is by looking at visual media, particularly road signs and costume design. Take this sign, for example. It indicates that you should drive carefully because there are potentially kangaroos on the road ahead of you. And also look at traffic lights, for example. Green means go, yellow means slow down, and red means stop. And you'll notice that these lights don't say go, slow down, or stop. But we have a cultural understanding that green is a good colour and yellow and red are warning colours. And that's one reason why road signs, at least in Australia, follow this colour scheme. We have green signs that give us place names and directions, yellow signs that give us warnings, and red signs that say stop. And when we turn our attention to other forms of visual media, you'll notice that colour plays a really important role. I've already talked extensively about costume design in Bungo Stray Dogs, so if this is something that interests you, I'd suggest you go check out that video. But for the rest of you, let's just move on. Now, how do you identify symbolism? The best way is definitely to use a lens of your choice. Because remember, when we're looking at a text through a lens, we're paying attention to really important things that match up with a certain theme. So when you're using a feminist lens, you're looking at how gender roles are portrayed within the story. When you're using an eco-criticism lens, you're looking at the relationship between humanity and nature and how they are portrayed. And as you do this, you're going to notice that there are specific symbols that you can associate with your lens or theme. And often, but not always, these symbols will recur. They'll pop up again and again and again. So let's say that we're analysing a text through a psychoanalytic lens. We would want to pay close attention to our character's state of mind, and our goal this time is to focus on the symbolism that is used to do that. So let's work through an example together. This is one of my favourite poems of all time. It's called The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock by T.S. Eliot. And we're only going to look at 2 excerpts for this example, but I've linked the full poem in the description as well. And as a hint, this is going to feature heavily in the poetry analysis video, so if you want to have a little look through and do your own analysis first, you can go ahead and do that. Now, to me, the most interesting thing about Prufrock is that he thinks very highly and very poorly of himself at the same time. And throughout this poem, which we can imagine is like an entry into his journal, we notice that he's also really struggling with the idea of his own mortality. And both of these excerpts use imagery or symbolism to describe the ever-ongoing cycle of life. Let's have a look at excerpt 1 first. For I have known them all already, known them all, have known the evenings, mornings, afternoons. I have measured out my life with coffee spoons. I know the voices dying with a dying fall, beneath the music from a farther room. So how should I presume? It's suggested here that Prufrock knows the mornings, evenings, and afternoons. Eliot has personified time. He's given it human and animal qualities, not only in this excerpt, but throughout the poem, and this is our first symbol. He also says, I have measured out my life with coffee spoons, which creates a very specific image of how this character lives his life. His life seems secluded and lonely and not at all exciting. It's the kind of life where the number of coffee spoons that he's used indicate how many days have passed. So this becomes our second symbol. Now let's look at excerpt 2. And the afternoon, the evening sleeps so peacefully, smoothed by long fingers, asleep, tired, or it malingers, stretched on the floor here beside you and me. Should I, after tea and cakes and ices, have the strength to force the moment to its crisis? But though I have wept and fasted, wept and prayed, though I have seen my head grown slightly bald, brought in upon a platter, I am no prophet, and here's no great matter. I have seen the moment of my greatness flicker, and I have seen the eternal footman hold my coat and snicker, and in short, I was afraid. Here we see more of the personification of time. The evening is described in the way that you would a domestic dog or cat. And there are lots of tiny, interesting little details and symbols within this passage, but I'm going to leave it to you and skip to the very end, where we see a reference to a cultural icon. The eternal footman is supposed to represent the Grim Reaper. This is one of my favourite lines in the entire poem because it's so creepy, but again, it gives us a really good insight into Prufrock's mentality. He thinks about his own death so much that he has personified it. So these symbols, the personification of time, the Grim Reaper, and coffee spoons, are easier for us to spot when we use the psychoanalytic lens because we're paying really close attention to Prufrock's mentality. And we're able to conclude that he's a very anxious individual, maybe driven a little bit crazy by loneliness, and he has no self-confidence to speak of. Now, as we're thinking about that poem and moving on to how to write your first analytical piece, I want you to know that it's extremely unlikely that you'll ever uncover absolutely everything hidden within a text. Even if you want to, I promise that if you go into reading something trying to think of every single lens and every single symbol, it's not going to go well. It's just not going to compute. And look, it's really easy to get overwhelmed when you're trying to decide if your focus will be on a character or a plot point or a symbol. When I'm trying to decide exactly what I want to analyze, I kind of end up like that cat. But knowing the things that you need to talk about is the best way to narrow down what kind of lens you're going to use, for example. And in the first Analysis 101 video, I talked a little bit about the basic things that you should include, but I didn't talk about everything, so let's get into that now. The way that you write your analysis will depend on the kind of evidence that you want to show and whether or not you need to comply to any specific standards. I know that literature teachers love to ask people to use the Teal and Ticker methods because they're really easy to remember, but assuming that you're writing these in your spare time or you don't have to follow a specific set of standards, not every single paragraph has to be topic, evidence, explanation, link. You can verge out and make it more interesting. You'll need an introduction and a conclusion at the beginning and the end, and the role of the introduction is to introduce the text that you're analyzing, but also to highlight the important points that you'll be making throughout the analysis. You'll notice that I did that in the beginning of this video, so I think that's a pretty good example. Honestly, you can go back and check that if you want. And your conclusion gives you the chance to highlight all of your important points one more time. You want to draw your audience's attention to everything that you've just shown them so that they take away the most important pieces of information. And we don't write conclusions because we think our audience is stupid. We write them because we imagine that they're possibly forgetful. Everything else is totally up to you. Here are the 3 things that you need, and as long as they make sense and it flows really well, they can be put in any order that you like. Number 1, you want to introduce the topic or topics that you'll be discussing in each part of your analysis. And this part can be as long or as short as you like, but give us a little bit of an overview of what you'll be discussing in depth. 2, you want as much evidence as you can possibly give them without it being too much. If you're highlighting a specific quote, for example, you don't want to put in the entire paragraph, you just want to take out the important context. And make sure that sure that you cite your sources as well, so include page numbers, volume numbers, line numbers, anything that can make it as easy as possible for your audience to fact check you. And 3, you need an argument, and this should make up the bulk of what you're writing. I talked a bit in my last video about what an argument is, and in this context, it should tie together your theme and your evidence so that everything makes sense. Take those 3 things, wrap them up in a bundle, and you have a single paragraph or chapter or whatever it is that you're writing. And depending on how long those paragraphs or chapters are, you'll want 3 to 4 of them in each analysis. If you're doing something in short form, then 1 or 2 is plenty. But still, this all begs the question, how do you take your thoughts and ideas and turn them into a critical analysis? And this really isn't an easy question to answer, because at this stage for me, it feels like everything's just laid out in front of me. For me, it's very natural. When I want to analyze something, all of the symbols and important parts pop up in front of my eyes, and I just have to talk about them. And I know that this isn't the answer that you all really want, but the best way to get better at this is by practicing. When I was in year 12, there was a period of like 3 weeks where my literature teacher wanted us to write an essay every day. And I don't think I did it every day, but I really tried. Did I get any better? No, but to be fair, I was studying for 3 other subjects at the same time, and she was being extra harsh on me because I needed to practice. But you know, whatever. Now, practicing doesn't mean that you have to write an essay every day. It doesn't have to be difficult. In fact, I would really recommend that you start with something that's really easy to you and then try to dig a little bit deeper. You can look into an example that we've worked through together. You can look at a book that you're studying at school, maybe your favorite story of all time. It's okay to start by looking at the surface, making some observations, and then digging a little bit deeper. And if you wanted to talk to me or anyone else in the comment section about some observations that you're making, try any of the 3 texts that I've linked in the description. You've got a pretty wide variety of choices there. They're all really different. They have really different themes and ideas. And of course, if you don't want to talk about your ideas publicly, you can send me a DM on any of my platforms, or you can send an anonymous ask via RetroSpring or Tumblr. I'm really excited at the idea of seeing your thoughts because these 3 texts are ones that I really love. And that brings us to the end of Analysis 101 Part 2. I really hope that this is everything you guys wanted. I know I couldn't get to every request, but they will feature in future videos. In between these longer video posts, I'm much more active on Twitter, Tumblr, and Instagram. I've kind of given up on TikTok for now. If you go to my profile, you'll see exactly why, but it's a whole thing. And because I've got such a huge following on there, I'm still going to post important updates, like when I post new videos, for example. So please give this video a like if you wanna, that would mean a lot to me. Subscribe if you wanna, that would also mean a lot to me, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!